Welcome back to Chamber Exchange, a TV show brought to you by our sponsors, Bank Hometown and the Worcester Railers Hockey Club. Thrilled to have with us in this segment Ed Lambert, who is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, a longtime friend, former mayor of Fall River, a legislator prior to that, served at the highest levels in the Patrick Murray administration, but somebody who has worked in and around the issues of education his entire life. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be here with you in the great city of Worcester.
Yeah, well, you know, in this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the MCAS and how this whole, pandemic situation has impacted education and how do we continue to try to strive for educational excellence for kids across the state. But maybe you could give a little background about MBAE and what the organization does and how you've been working during this pandemic.
Well, the Mass Business Alliance for Education is a 30-year-old nonprofit. The Worcester Chamber is a terrific affiliate of ours, and we really appreciate the partnership. We represent 38 affiliates across the state, chambers of commerce, statewide industry associations. And we were founded by a couple of folks with some Worcester roots back 30 years ago. Paul Revel, of course, who became Secretary of Education, and Jack Rennie, who was the CEO of Pacer Systems. And they wanted to help facilitate getting business leaders more involved in the quality of education, issues of equity, making sure that every student had a fair opportunity to a high quality educational program. So for the last 30 years, that's what we've been doing. And starting with the 1993 Education Reform Act, through 3 decades of trying to preserve and protect some of the reforms that took place, business leaders who support more money for education as long as it comes with some return on investment and measurement of outcomes and some accountability. And most recently with the Student Opportunity Act a couple of years ago.
And we hear from our members that the single biggest issue is workforce, access to talent, giving people the skills to be entrepreneurs themselves. And as former mayors and chairs of school committee, we see many of the challenges that our teachers and our kids and families face. And oftentimes resources are important, but if we are going to put those resources in, as you mentioned, the whole issue around education reform in '93, subsequent improvements to that, and then more recently the Student Opportunity Act, we want to make sure we're adopting best practices in districts and things are going in the right direction. And while the MCAS may not be perfect, it is an important tool.
You're exactly right. And since MCAS was incorporated here in Massachusetts, one of the first in the country to use a statewide common assessment. Massachusetts educational achievement has gone from about a middle of the pack in the early 90s to first in the nation. And even as recently as 2019, our students in 4th and 8th grade finished first in the country in in English language arts, and first in 4th grade English language arts. I think Minnesota beat us out on 8th grade math. Yeah. But we have consistently as a state been at the top of the pack. And in large part it's because we married both financial investments and reform and measurement and high standards. And that's really what's most important. The issuance of high standards is an equity issue. Prior to 1993, prior to MCAS, every district had their own set of standards. And we know, unfortunately, in some districts, oftentimes the larger urban poorer districts, we weren't putting expectations on whether or not we thought kids could actually learn and achieve. And so kids were not getting an equal opportunity. So MCAS is really the great equalizer in terms of, sometimes it gives us information we prefer not to see, but we shouldn't shoot the messenger.
Right.
So Massachusetts is first in the nation, but we also have some of the largest achievement gaps, which means there are a lot of students in our gateway cities who are still far behind. And that's what the Student Opportunity Act was attempting to address, that we've got to make greater investments in cities like Worcester and Fall River and New Bedford.
But those investments should be made in things that work and are proven.
Exactly.
And not in those things of just doing more of the same.
Exactly. And that's where, with your support and the support of the Chamber, our organization was able to influence that legislation so it wasn't just about money. In fact, our catchphrase at the time was no blank checks. We think that money is important, but just as important is how you spend that money. So best practices, data-driven outcomes. When you look around the country, you can see that things like universal pre-K, early college, extended learning time, wraparound services for students. These things make a difference in terms of academic achievement. So the Student Opportunity Act said to districts, you will get the money, but you have to submit a 3-year plan as to how you're going to spend the money on one or several of these best practices. And then every community gets to choose what's best for them, as long as they're in those lanes, as long as they're choosing proven practices.
And one of the issues that MBAE advocated for was, even during the pandemic, continuing to test on the MCAS, not having it as a requirement per se of graduation, but also testing so that we could measure, because we all know that MCAS had that the pandemic had a detrimental impact on student learning, and it's important to measure that, and MCAS is, again, one of those tools that can help us measure that.
We were really pleased that the state decided not to abandon testing during the pandemic. If anything, it's even more important to find out how students have been affected, what level of learning loss has there been, and diagnostically, how do we get students back on track? And so you're right, we think the state hit the right balance of saying, okay, for the next year or two, we're not going to use it to hold schools or teachers accountable. We're not going to deny kids diplomas, but we're still going to give the tests so that we know exactly what it was that students lost and how they were impacted. And no surprise, just as has happened around the country, the test results show that there was an impact to learning. Test scores in Massachusetts went down. Interestingly enough, they went down pretty equally across both urban and suburban districts, so it wasn't just urban districts that were affected. I know that in Worcester, the pass rate on math went down 16 points, and in English language arts it was about 6 points. What we have found across the country and across Massachusetts, that the pandemic affected math learning much more than English language arts, because if you think about it, to the extent that kids were subjected to remote learning, math has just become a more difficult subject to teach remotely than maybe English language arts.
But just on a very basic level, though, that information is helpful. So as teachers devote their time, schools consider the deployment of additional resources, it can be focused on those areas where there's been those larger gaps. So again, it's using best practices, it's using taxpayer dollars in a fiduciary and smart way, and that's just one example of how it can be important to measure.
And what the state also did, which was really helpful this year, was they released the results to districts early. So the test was administered in the spring, in April and May, and by July, superintendents had the data for their students individually so that their teachers could start making plans as soon as kids came back in the school in September, which kids didn't meet which standards. And now they can use some best practices to catch kids up. There are things called like high impact tutoring, where you take 3 or 4 kids, even if they're in different classes, who might have missed the same kinds of standards, and put them together. High dosage tutoring during the course of a school day, and not after school tutoring, but integrated in the school day, can make up a whole year of lost learning just within 3 months.
Right. Targeting those resources in a strategic way that embraces the best practices that are out there, that leads to more positive educational outcomes for our kids. That's what it's about.
That's exactly right.
Just in the minute we have left, Student Opportunity Act coming forward.
Well, we have the Student Opportunity Act. The state has committed to increasing funding $1.5 billion.
ARPA money.
ARPA, and then of course there's the federal. It's a great way to end, right? It's always good news, but there's a huge amount, $2.5 billion to school districts, and another $5 billion to the state. This is a real opportunity. MBAE is advocating for the same kind of guardrails around the federal money that were around the SOA money, to ask districts, you get this great opportunity, let's think strategically about how to spend it. We don't want a situation 3 or 4 years from now that money's gone and we're looking around saying, what happened? So let's really use it to change and transform the status quo, do much better for kids, make sure they're better prepared for college and career. And I know that's something that would be very helpful to businesses in the Worcester region. So we really want to thank you and the Chamber for your leadership. You folks have been very active in these education policy issues, and we think that that's really important. Education isn't just for responsibility for educators. We all own it. So thank you very much.
Great. Ed Lambert, Executive Director of the Mass Business Alliance for Education. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Tim.
We're going to be back for our final segment. Stay with us.
These days, you've got your hands full in life. That's why we help you bank simply and securely. with tools like Face ID and Touch ID. It's why we make it easy to make purchases on the go and get cash back while you're at it. Why we help you quickly deposit checks wherever you are. And it's why we lend a hand with sending and receiving money right from your phone. So even when you're on the move, you can manage your finances. Bank Hometown. Unlock your potential.
Being associated with the Railers and being a part has been awesome, and it's been a lot of fun.
I think my students' initial reactions is my favorite part. Their eyes get really wide and they're in awe.
And then you have the excitement of hockey, and you have that anticipation in the air. You know, the crowd getting into it. It's fun.
Worcester, a city with heart, history, and promise. A hub of innovation in life sciences, education, and healthcare. Home to multi-generational families, first-generation citizens, and next-generation baseball and hockey greats. Home to great parks, world-class museums, theaters, and restaurants. Worcester, the place to visit, to invest, and to call home.
This is Radio Worcester. Local talk, local news, local events. We got it, and we've got opinions that you're going to want to hear.
That Worcester will be thought of and spoken about.
We're live every morning, 6 to 10 a.m., and if you can't catch us then, you can find us online, day and night, at radioworcester.com. This is your town. This is your morning show. Talk of the Commonwealth with Hank and Ben.